Thank you everyone for joining us today in the flesh for our annual ESCoE Conference on Economic Measurement. My name is Grant Fitzner. I'll be introducing our speaker, Charlie Bing, and we'll also be handling questions after the presentation. There's plenty of time for questions, so do have a think about those as we go through this morning's presentation. I have been asked to make some housekeeping announcements. Before I do that, I just want to say who I am. Grant Fitzner, Chief Economist at the ONS. I've been closely involved in ESCoE over recent years, and it's really a delight to be here and see all these, some familiar and some not so familiar faces. On housekeeping, there are no planned fire alarm tests today, so if an alarm does go off, please treat it as genuine. Please do familiarise yourself with the fire exits, and the assembly points are towards the east of the building in the direction of the High Street on the corner of Shuttle and George Street. No food is allowed in the auditorium, please. Smoking is prohibited in all university buildings, and toilets and lifts are situated in the foyer. So just a few comments before I hand over. For many of you will be familiar with Sir Charles Bean and his work over the years and the many roles that he's played. And it'd be fair to say you could describe him as the founding father of ESCoE. And of course, it was the Bean report, the 2016 independent report on the economy and economic statistics that made a recommendation to set up a centre of excellence for the analysis and of emerging and future issues in measuring the modern economy, and really kicked off a great deal of work at the Office for National Statistics, including, of course, setting up the Data Science Campus, setting up ESCoE, a whole range of work streams to modernise and improve our economic statistics, lots of research, and a great deal beyond. And although I expect Charlie will focus mostly on ESCoE and those kind of related issues, we've also seen greater focus on using big data, administrative data, more use of data science methods, more analysis and curiosity in how we interpret and make sense of what's going on in the economy, a more nimble and agile approach, and addressing what I think was euphemistically called existing statistical limitations, which is a polite way of saying there were some somewhat embarrassing errors, corrections, and quality issues around some of our statistics if you go back prior to the Bean review, most of which I'm hoping have now been addressed. It's worth also saying in terms of ESCoE, this is the 6th year of the current ESCoE contract, 6th and final year of the ESCoE contract, which expires in March of next year. Next Tuesday, the ONS will be going out to procurement for ESCoE 2, the new 5-year contract. Richard Hayes and I are here. Rich, do you want to make yourself available? If anyone is interested in being part of a bid or a consortium, or certainly being engaged in that procurement process, then please have a conversation with Richard or I over the course of the conference, and we'd be happy to give you a sense of kind of where we're looking for ESCoE 2. One other reflection, back in 2020, I was asked to lead the COVID response, to coordinate the COVID response for the ONS as we headed into the first lockdown. And we were in a somewhat different position to quite a number of other national statistical institutes at the time, because thanks in large part to Sir Charlie's report and implementing those recommendations, we had a data science campus. We had analysts out on secondment to 2 major financial institutions, so we had access to effectively real-time card payment spending data. We had a faster indicators bulletin, and we have been producing for a couple of years monthly GDP in addition to quarterly GDP. So actually we were quite well placed to get a sense of what was going on in quite a timely way. Now, in addition to that, we then added a number of other surveys, including Business Insights and Conditions Survey, which gave us some real insight into what the impact of the pandemic was having on the economy. But we really would have been in a much worse position if it hadn't been for the Bean report and the various recommendations that we had implemented as a result. So I think if you're impressed by the way the ONS has responded to the pandemic, I think the Bean report was a key element of that in terms of setting some of those underpinnings and enabling us to be nimble in response. Just a few thank yous as well. I'd like to thank the 3 chairs of the Scientific Committee, Gary Koop, Bart Loss, and Sanjeev Maharajan, and also the organising committee for this conference, which was being led by Caroline Lewis at the ONS and Sarah Shepherd at ESCoE, as well as local organisers Stuart McIntyre. Thank you for what I'm sure will be a well-run and interesting conference. And then finally, I'd also like to thank the director of ESCoE, Rebecca Riley. Dealing with academics, university contracts, paperwork and contracts is something that I thankfully don't have to do because we have the ESCoE team to do that. I've really been impressed not just by the range of research that ESCoE has commissioned, but by the speed with which we're able to bring some of the best academic expertise around the world to bear on issues of the moment that are facing ONS. And that's been incredibly valuable. So I really want to thank Rebecca and her team for all that they've done to make that work so smoothly and effectively. I just reminded there will be plenty of time for questions after the presentation. There'll be roving mics. And for those online, please add your questions and we'll try and pick those up as well. And I'll now hand over to Sir Charles Bean.
Okay, well, morning everyone. I have to say it's really great being back doing something physical as opposed to being online. And the one thing we really learned through the pandemic is that you can do a lot online, but you also learned that it's a pale imitation of the real thing. So it is really nice being back in a physical conference. This is actually the first such event that certainly I've been to since the pandemic. Some of you might have been lucky enough to have had a physical conference, but for me, it's the first. Anyway, the organisers asked me to talk a bit about how the statistical landscape has changed since I produced my report. It actually says 5 years ago. As you'll realise when I get through the slides, it was actually published 6 years ago in 2016. But in my defence, I will simply say that when I provided the title, it was actually only 5 years on. So, the review 6 years on and the next 6 years sounds a bit weird anyway. So I thought this title I'd stick with. Okay, it's going to be a game of 2 halves. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the context for my review, which seems to be called Bean Review for short, and some of the progress that has been made since then. For half-time entertainment, I'll talk a little bit about what happened during the pandemic, some of the issues that particularly arose for us at the Office of Budget Responsibility, where I was part-time during the pandemic, some of the statistical issues. And then the second half is going to be a bit of crystal ball gazing about some of the issues that might be arising in the future, particularly in respect of statistical needs. So let me start by saying a little bit about the review and the context for it. It was commissioned by George Osborne, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Matt Hancock, who was at that time Minister for the Cabinet Office. Of course, lots happened to both of those political figures since they commissioned my report. But the background to it was one of a sense of unease, declining trust, if you like, in UK economic statistics. It's partly prompted by several instances where statistics had to be withdrawn, lost their official statistics. Monaco, errors were discovered then, and so forth. So there was that as one driver for it. But alongside that, both the Chancellor and Matt Hancock were particularly interested in the impact of the new economy, the digital economy, on the economic statistics. And in particular, they were concerned less inappropriate measurement of those new developments was leading to an understatement of the UK's rate of growth. Surprise, surprise. So that was the context. But then during the commissioning process, the remit that I was given broadened out somewhat, so that in the end, it basically covered present and future statistics needs, the effectiveness of the ONS in delivering those statistics, and also the governance framework. And the vision that underlay the report was basically moving the ONS away from being purely a factory producing regular statistics to become more of a smart provider and interpreter of statistics. And that was underpinned by several required changes. So first of all, greater analytical capability in the organization itself. Secondly, developing a more self-critical culture, less defensive. Thirdly, better technology and systems, and certainly the ONS staff here will remember how clunky the systems used to be. They may still be pockets of clunkiness, but things have certainly advanced significantly in the last few years in that regard. Fourthly, better monitoring and rectification of issues of quality or relevance in the statistics. And finally, enhanced transparency. Now, it's worth stressing that, I mean, Grant gave me some very kind introductory remarks about, how much this set the roadmap and so forth. The roadmap here was basically what ONS management under John Pullinger basically wanted to follow. And I always saw myself as much more like the management consultant coming in from outside, that management knows what it wants to do, and it's helpful to have somebody outside writing it down, particularly in terms of providing it with the collateral for either achieving change inside, or in this case, I have to say, the collateral in terms of more money from the Exchequer, since the review was quite useful in giving George Osborne an excuse to provide an additional increment to the ONS's funding allocation. And that made possible some of the changes that I recommended. So as I say, the report was delivered in 2016. There were 24 recommendations under 6 headings. I'm not going to go through all of the recommendations, as some of the recommendations had sub-elements and so forth. And it would be extremely tedious to do that. But the 6 broad headings were addressing existing statistical shortcomings, or Grant referred to them as limitations. Secondly, becoming more agile in capturing new economic developments, the digital economy and other aspects of the changing economy. Thirdly, focusing more on meeting the needs of users, that word's being more outward looking. Fourthly, making better use of existing and new data sources. Fifthly, interrogating the data more effectively than was the case at the time, with the aim of preventing unnecessary withdrawal or correction of statistics. And finally, refocusing the governance arrangements on maintaining quality. Now, I should say an important element of the recommendations in my review was to try and foster better links with outside experts and users. And a key recommendation within that, actually it's 2 recommendations to be precise, was the establishment of 2 centres of excellence, one on economic statistics, which became ESCoE, and the other was in data science, which has become the data science campus. It's worth saying that I saw those playing slightly different roles. In the case of data science, this was somewhere where there was a lot of work going on outside in digital companies and academia and so forth. And it was a case of feeding that in to the ONS's work. In the case of ESCoE, I saw this very much as a 2-way thing. So it was not only a vehicle for getting economic thinking into the ONS, but also I wanted to see if we could use it as a catalyst to try and get academic economists more interested in measurement issues. I have to say, you know, most undergraduate courses, say macro, which I taught for many years, you know, maybe you'll get one lecture at the beginning on national income accounting. In fact, I, in my unwise youth, it was even worse than that. I told the students to read the book and that I'd set a question on the exam, which was a mechanism for getting them to read it. But then gaily went on talking about the theory and so forth. And what I've learned as I've grown older and spent more time in the policymaking world is the importance of measurement issues, of thinking more about measurement and whether statistics reflect the concepts that you're interested in and so forth. The tenor of the recommendations here, as I say, would to try and act as a bit of a catalyst for academics to change what they were interested in. Now, a couple of things that I'll mention here, they weren't particularly in my report, but the ONS introduced, which are consistent with this general agenda, was the institution of ONS fellows, experts and academics from outside who are attached to the ONS, and the ONS Economic Experts Group, and then focusing things down at a somewhat lower level, the ONS Renaissance Prize for an undergraduate essay, which I'm very pleased to say this year has been won by some LSE students. Are any of them in the room? No, no, they're supposed to be here having a poster session. They may be too modest to reveal themselves. The ONS has also been pushing forward work on developing a statistical book for students as well, which I should have mentioned here too. So there's been quite a lot of work in that space. Okay, I'm not going to judge progress against all my 24 recommendations, but I think it's worth just me referencing some of the work that's been done in addressing the existing shortcomings or limitations in the period since I provided my report. Firstly, there's been a lot of improvements to the measurement of GDP. One of the shortcomings at the time that I suggested needed addressing was to introduce proper double deflation, which basically required proper measurement of inputs. The ONS have introduced annual supply and use balancing at constant prices. It's been the reinstatement of the purchases survey. Important innovation is the use of value-added tax and PAYE data, administrative data, bringing some of that information into measures of GDP expenditure and GDP by income. In addition, there's been the move, as Grant referenced, to a monthly GDP release. So I think very considerable advances there. Taken in conjunction with the improvements in deflators, particularly in the telecoms area, I think it's worth me just commenting on the introduction of double deflation. This is something that shouldn't really affect measures of aggregate GDP. It affects the industrial composition of value added. But it is notable, I think, that the advances here have changed the picture of what's going on underneath the surface with productivity developments in recent years. In particular, in the old data, it suggested that a lot of the problem was a slowdown in productivity growth in telecoms, which seemed very implausible. It's something that I flagged in the review. In the current data with these new deflators and so forth, the story looks very different. With a lot of the productivity growth in recent years, what there has been at least, has originated in the telecoms sector, and much less of it therefore being associated with other industries. I think that's something that intuitively makes good sense. So this is an example of something which, to the non-cognoscenti, they might think, oh, this is all very arcane detail, double deflation, what does that really amount to? But it does actually change the underlying economic story somewhat. A third element where there's been quite a lot of advances, and this was something that was flagged in the review as important. We measured manufacturing in humongous detail, but had a much looser assessment of what was going on in services. There's been a lot of work to try and improve measurement of service industries. Enhancement to the trade statistics, and trade statistics were one of those statistics that were implicated in the setting up of the review in the first place. Provision of regional gross value added, which is an important step in providing input into things like the levelling up agenda, although I think more needs to be done in that space, which I'll mention later on. There's been quite a lot of work in improving measures of productivity, quarterly measures of total factor productivity, although ONS insists on referring to it as multi-factor productivity. I shall refer to it as academics to a total factor productivity, but it's the same thing. Also improving measures of other inputs, labour and capital. Another issue that my review flagged was holes in the flow of fund statistics, where ideally regulators and the Bank of England want information on from whom to whom flows, and there's been considerable progress in plugging those gaps. And then finally, there's been quite a lot of work in the what's sometimes referred to as beyond GDP agenda, looking at activity that takes place outside the production boundary in the household sector. That's an issue that was flagged in connection with the new economy and disintermediation of activities from the market sector into the household sector. And also work on measuring missing capitals, so things like natural capital, which the Dasgupta report highlighted. And I'll come back to that right at the end of the talk. Okay, so that's a partial list of dealing with the legacy of limitations. In terms of capturing the new economy, if you want to call it that, I think I'd put this more as ongoing work, and that's almost inevitably the case because the nature of the new economy is continually developing and changing. My review pointed to the increased difficulty of capturing quality change. We've introduced smartphones to replace regular phones, but smartphones obviously do a huge range of things that old-fashioned mobile phones didn't. The shift of activities that previously were done in the market sector, like travel agents, increasingly into homework with people doing research, booking, travel or their accommodation themselves, and some of that activity not being reflected into the national accounts. The prevalence of non-standard business models in digital territory, so digital providers who would provide some content free, but then finance their activities through forcing you to consume pop-up advertising and the like. Also increasingly non-standard employment models, people doing lots of short jobs that they get through apps, which is referred to as the gig economy. The increased importance of intangible capital, knowledge capital, so forth. Now, I think what we've seen in the last few years is a growing body of research that's got further into understanding the implications of all of this, both in academia, in ESCoE, and also within the ONS itself. But I think it's an ongoing task to incorporate these insights, which will no doubt continue to grow, as I will say later on. A second important issue that I focused on was the role of globalization. In particular, something I made quite a lot of was the essentially geographical redenomination of production through appropriately chosen transfer pricing and the like, which enabled international companies to shift their declared location of profits to low tax jurisdictions, what's referred to in the jargon as base erosion and profit shifting. that still remains an issue, but I think it's fair to say that the last few years has quite reasonably prompted the ONS perhaps to shift back to a more traditional focus on the trade data. So inevitably Brexit has raised questions about the impact of leaving the EU on our trade. And here I'll just flag up something which I think is an interesting semi-puzzle at this stage. So this pair of charts shows UK trade with the EU and the rest of the world. This is taken from the OBR's latest economic and fiscal outlook, split into imports and exports. Obviously, you get big dips in trade at the time of the pandemic both ways. Then we've got the period since the UK formally left the EU, shaded at the end. And the thing that I would draw your attention to is that, not surprisingly, there's been a reduction in trade, particularly goods trade, at the time of exit. But notice that exports to the EU have recovered somewhat. But interestingly, imports from the EU, which is the green line, have not. Similarly, over when we look at services. Now, that is actually quite puzzling because as it stands at the moment, it's the EU which has essentially enforced the additional non-tariff barriers on the UK, or we've imposed it on ourselves by leaving, I should say. So there are more obstacles to our exports to the EU than they were. But as yet, the UK has held off imposing a lot of the analogous barriers on imports from the EU into the UK, and it keeps on postponing it every 6 months. So this is the opposite way round from what you would have expected. You would have expected it to be in exports that didn't recover, but imports did. And the story seems to be that EU exporters to the UK have just decided, well, we're not that important as a market for them. And even though the non-tariff barriers have not been introduced yet, they're less interested in exporting to us. That may be the story, it may not, but I think this will be an area where there will be continued interest in the coming years. The work on capturing new economic developments and the remedial work I have on the previous slide, been very much supported by work carried out at ESCoE. ESCoE, despite the name, is not a centre. It's really a hub and spoke model with lots of people connected with the organisation throughout, well, not just throughout the country, but also foreign affiliates as well, working on these issues. So there's 37 affiliates and 92 research associates. So it's a pretty big network of people who are interested in these measurement issues. ESCoE has produced a lot of output in its 5 years of existence. I think I'd pick out its contribution to the improvements in GDP that I talked about before, and better measurement of services, where it's worked closely with the ONS, work on the impact of the digital economy, measuring human and intangible capital, and finally on developing a historical, continuous historical database. One of the bugbears of a lot of academic macroeconomists is that the official ONS data run back to 1997, something like that. And I'd have students who'd run a regression and come to me and it would just start in 1997. And I'd say, well, you realize the economy started before 1997. Well, we couldn't find the data. You know, of course, the data was there, just not necessarily fully consistent with more recent data. So having a coherent back historical database is certainly very useful for academic researchers. I think the fact that there are so many people present at this conference is indicative of the extent to which ESCoE has connected people on both sides of the divide, academia and the ONS. So I won't give you data on attendance at the conference. What I will just do is show you a couple of slides on attendance at other ONS events. So this is seminars and webinars by types of organization. Not surprisingly, attendance went up as a result of the pandemic when things moved online. But nevertheless, I think it shows quite a strong engagement with the work that's taking place through the ESCoE network, including not just in academia, but this presumably a lot of these will be ONS, but not exclusively. We'll include people in statistical institutes in other countries, and also in other public bodies. And what's also interesting is the way that has broadened out from being very UK in focus at the beginning, that being online has enabled engagement of, well, particularly people in Europe, but also in North America and the rest of the world. And I guess one of the challenges going forward as we go back to a world of physical events is how you preserve that sort of broader international engagement as well. Okay, so that's some of the work connected with new economic developments. On making better use of data, this was something that I particularly wanted to push in the review. It has to be said that existing gateways for the use of administrative data held by the public sector were clunky in the extreme, made it very difficult to use them. And the Digital Economy Act, which is an omnibus act covering lots of aspects of the digital economy, but did include 2 chapters which provided gateways for access to research and statistical purposes. And that has been very helpful in enabling the ONS to have access to data from HMRC on value-added tax and PAYE, which can feed into national accounts production. Now, that said, I think it is worth saying that although the provisions of the Digital Economy Act were a considerable improvement on what was there before, and it sets out the protocols that need to be observed and gives the ONS the right to access data for statistical purposes and so forth. It can still be hard work getting the data out of departments. At the OBR, we had the same right to access to data from departments where we needed it to do our work. Although you might in principle have the right of access, it can still take quite a lot of effort persuading people that they really need to provide it to you, and sometimes needs you to elevate things to relatively high levels in the civil service to unlock it. And what's needed here is a sort of change of heart and minds within the civil service to realize that, you know, you should want to share the data because it facilitates a more efficient provision of public services. That, I think, is important because if we ever really want to provide data which is sufficiently granular to address regional issues such as the levelling up agenda of the current government, I've always thought it's not really feasible to think about doing this purely through surveys, ONS surveys, because they just have to be too huge to accomplish it. You really do need to be able to try and exploit administrative data, particularly those ones which have appropriate local identifiers, which enable you to link up data sets. And going forward, I would see this as quite an important piece of work on the agenda. The Digital Economy Act also facilitated researchers accessing the microdata, which they can now do through the virtual microdata laboratory. This is what was already happening, say, in Canada. I believe there were some teething troubles at the beginning with this, but as far as I know, it's working okay. ONS and others have been exploring the use of collecting data through web scraping, also using private sources of big data, scanner data. And this is an obvious way to go. There's also been a shift towards much greater collection of data online, replacing paper surveys and so forth. And all of this has been supported by the work of the Data Science Campus. Now, I should say I'm not so well cited on the work that the Data Science Campus has been carrying out. But I assume it's doing its job. Okay, so one slide on the pandemic and the challenges from the pandemic before we get to crystal ball gazing. Now, the ONS was never going to have people standing on their doorsteps with their pots and pans, banging them every Friday evening or whatever it was, in the way we did for the NHS. But having said that, I do think the ONS had a pretty good pandemic one way and another. A minor hero, if not a major hero, of dealing with the pandemic. The first thing I'd flag, although it's not an economic statistic as such, was the introduction of the ONS infection survey, which the pilot study, I think, was May of 2020, very early in the pandemic. And then the full regular thing came in about October. Now, if you think back to the early stages of the pandemic, there was quite a lot of debate among epidemiologists, economists for that matter, about the extent of the disease, the prevalence of the disease. And in particular, there were medical people who were arguing that the disease was much more widespread than we thought, but many people were catching it and not really being very seriously affected, asymptomatic infections. And therefore the disease could be expected to run its course much more quickly. And until we had widespread random testing through the ONS survey, we didn't really know the answer to that. And the answer was that there wasn't anything like the level of asymptomatic infections that some people had argued there might be. So I think the infection survey was very important at enabling policymakers to actually get a handle on really what was going on with the disease. And I think it's an object lesson in the value of using what might have been scarce testing capacity to actually find out what's happening. If you remember, at the early stage of the pandemic, the testing capacity was all being used to test people who were showing up at hospitals to see whether they were infected or not, or people in maybe key roles. But random testing was important for finding out what was going on. Then moving on to the economic impact of the pandemic, and in particular the impact of the health measures, or in the jargon, non-pharmaceutical interventions. Now, it's worth saying that this was an economic event where there was little past experience to guide policymakers. The government, the lockdown was deciding to effectively close a quarter, a third of the economy. We didn't know how people would adjust to that, how businesses would adjust to it, and so forth. And also the sheer fact of that closure severely compromised the collection of key statistics. So labour statistics, for instance, labour force survey has a face-to-face element to it at the outset. Prices, well, if you've closed physical stores, collecting price data in the normal way ceased to be viable. So ONS inevitably had to innovate in what it was doing, be pragmatic. One can always have disagreements about details, but the thing I think that was very valuable, and I would praise here, is that they were very transparent right early on about what the problems were and how they were going to respond to them. And that meant for users like us at the OBR, we had a much better window on what might be distorting the statistics, or how to interpret them in these unusual circumstances. The other thing I would say is, because this was an intervention which led to a very sharp, sudden change in activity, and similarly when the lockdown measures were reduced, again you get big changes. There was a very high value on real-time indicators, or things that were close to real-time indicators. So at the OBR, we were particularly using things like the Google mobility indices, which were essentially published daily. Now, they're an interesting example of a statistic which is constructed from people's movement from their smartphones. It's not directly measuring economic activity or anything like that, but turned out to be a useful correlate. So an example of using something which might not be directly measuring what you want, but nevertheless has useful indicative power. More directly useful, of course, was data on digital payments, which were valuable. Then I should mention its business interruption from COVID survey, I think it's the correct title, BICS survey, yeah, which the ONS introduced relatively early on. It was a regular survey of senior business people. Alongside that, I should also mention that the bank's decision maker panel survey, which similarly is a regular survey of senior decision makers. And those two were extremely useful for us in not just knowing what was going on, but why things were going on. So they shed light on, say, the impact on businesses, investment decisions, and so forth. Then finally, admin data was important, and here PAYE, the PAYE data was particularly valuable because, of course, the furlough scheme was administered through PAYE, and breaking that down by industry, regions, and so forth, gave a particularly useful insight. The advantages of agility, if you like. A couple of sort of problem areas for us that I would mention. The first was basically we didn't know the size of the population. And that's because migration data, which wasn't very good at the best of times, the International Passenger Survey is not a great survey for measuring inward and outward migration, but that was suspended through the pandemic for obvious reasons. Now, the reason this was of particular interest was that for us on the OBR, we obviously have to predict or assess the prospects for the public finances, tax revenues, and the like. And that's intimately linked to the supply capacity of the economy, and in particular the future supply capacity of the economy. And the central issue was the extent to which the pandemic would have long-lasting effects on supply capacity, so-called scarring, which could occur through its impact on the labour force, through its impact on capital, and also on total factor productivity. And we had to take judgments on each of those. But in particular, there were questions about the future size of the labour force. There was anecdotal evidence, certainly, that many migrant workers had probably gone home during the pandemic, back to their families and so forth, and a question of whether they would return or not post-Brexit. But the data here was not particularly reliable. O'Connor and Porter's produced a shall we say, contentious piece suggesting that the population could be over 1 million smaller than the official estimates. We looked on that as an indication, essentially, of the degree of uncertainty, potentially. Now, where we are now, we have better information, in part because of the use of national insurance numbers. But that was one particular area that was an issue for us at the OBR during the pandemic. The other issue that came up, which is less of an issue with our ONS statistics and perhaps more an issue with other countries' statistics, was that there was inevitably interest in international comparisons of the impact of the pandemic across countries. And was the UK hit worse than other countries? Was it hit worse because we've mismanaged the timing of lockdowns and so forth? So this was very sensitive territory politically. And a key complicating factor here was the different approaches to measuring non-market sector output in health, education, things like that, where the ONS has been very much in the vanguard of trying to use explicit measures of output, pupils taught, operations carried out, things like that, whereas many other countries are still in the old world of measuring outputs by their inputs. Now, in normal times, that may not be that big a deal. But of course, in an environment where there were big changes in what was going on in public sectors, within the health service, with cancellation of elective operations and replacement of that by care of pandemic patients, in education, people being homeschooled and so forth. The question then became, to what extent were the GDP numbers giving you a true picture of international differences, or were they being distorted by these differences in measurement? So as I say, this is not intended as a criticism of the ONS data. Quite the opposite. I think the ONS has been in the vanguard doing this right, but it's a signal of the complications that can arise in circumstances like this. Right, let me run on to the crystal ball gazing. First of all, future issues in the new economy. The first point is that digitalization, which has obviously been happening for some time, I think still has some way to run. And just as an indicator of this, this chart is taken from a recent European Investment Bank publication, a survey of digitalization in different countries in Europe. This is businesses, the extent of digitalization. So the survey actually looks at, I think, 6 different aspects of digitalization. Ask companies, you know, have you done this? Have you done that? Have you heard of this? Things like that. Now, I think, you know, we tend to think of the UK as being relatively advanced from a digital point of view as far as consumers are concerned. And I think that's supported by statistics. This I thought was quite interesting as a chart because it puts our corporate sector as a bit of a laggard, not a terrible laggard. You know, we're not as bad as the French. But clearly lagging the Swedes and the Finns, the Dutch and the Danes, so forth. You know, there's a story here, at least, you know, a chunk of the corporate sector probably lagging. And there's an interesting connection here with the evidence that suggests the UK has quite a long tail in underperforming firms. If you look at the distribution of productivity across firms, look at those distributions in different countries, it looks like the UK has a longer tail of underperformers, and that may be feeding into this. Oh, sorry. Okay, so you know, digitalization will continue. There's bound to be further changes in the as far as consumers are concerned, but in the corporate sector in particular, it looks like there's a way to go. So more of the same. I think the interesting question looking forward, though, is this all about to go up a gear, and in particular with the advent of artificial intelligence? So the question is this more of the same, or are we really on the threshold of the birth of what economists would describe as a new general purpose technology, of the same sort of thing as the steam engine that drove the industrial revolution, electricity and the internal combustion engine at the start of the 20th century, and then digital more recently. And, you know, I think there's good arguments for thinking that artificial intelligence will prove to be a very significant development that generates potentially large shifts in production and consumption. So obviously things like self-driving cars come in here. that of itself is obviously going to heighten those challenges in measuring quality change and prices, which already the ONS has to grapple with. On top of that, I think it's worth stressing something we already know from the work on intangible capital, but measuring artificial intelligence capital is going to be fairly tricky, because these are technologies which are often costly to develop, but cheap to replicate. That in turn potentially complicates understanding their consequences for productivity growth. So I can see there being challenges arising in that territory. On top of that, I think there'll be pressure for statistics in this space coming from another direction. Darren Asamoah has been arguing that what he calls as data externalities, which is basically the fact that digital and other companies who are acquiring this information can then use that data in ways that the person who is ultimately supplying the data, the consumer or whatever, can't really control, provides a case for regulation of those data-rich companies, the FANGs. This is Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. Although since they are rapidly changing their names so that they don't look objectionable, so Facebook has become Meta and Google has become Alphabet. So I think you can say they've been defanged. Sorry, couldn't resist that. Actually, they become manna, I suppose, haven't they? Data falls like manna from heaven. Anyway, I think that this will be another source of pressure for better statistics in this space to support the support regulation when it comes. But where there's threats, there are always opportunities. So I think the question for the ONS will be to what extent there is scope for using artificial intelligence in the collection and construction of official data. So I'll leave that as a counterweight. Future issues in the world of work. Obviously, the world of work changed hugely during the pandemic with increased working from home, and lots of businesses discovered that they could operate remotely, at least to some degree. And there's plenty of suggestion that businesses are likely to want to maintain some sort of flexible working arrangements, may vary across businesses. And there's a demand for workers, from workers for continuation of that. So this chart shows that the UK has been relatively slow to return to working in workplaces. This is from Google mobility data comparing travel to workplaces now with where we were pre-pandemic, still well down in the UK. And just this week, there was an ONS study which I think found that 84% of survey respondents wanted some degree of working flexibility, working from home in the future. Unfortunately, it arrived after I'd already provided these slides, otherwise I'd have nabbed a slide or two from it. But it's consistent with the idea that we're likely to see a maintenance of flexible working arrangements in the future. That presumably will have consequences for the locations, both where people live and where economic activity takes place, and tracking that will be of interest. So this connects back with what I was saying earlier about regional and sub-regional data being of importance and interest. The other dimension that I think would be worth drawing attention to is that the aging of the population is probably going to lead to more people spending some of their time effectively acting as unpaid carers for their elderly and infirm parents. Unfortunately, I don't have any children, so I don't know who's going to look after me when I fall into that bracket. But for lots of people, their offspring may be acting essentially as providing unpaid care work. On top of that, with people retiring sometime in their 60s, say still, but living quite healthy lives, say into their 80s, where they then start becoming more infirm. I think we'll probably see an expansion in people volunteering and doing various sorts of unpaid work. The bottom line from these two bullets, I think, is that measuring hours worked in the economy is going to become much more challenging than in the days when everybody did a 9-to-5 job, and you could pretty easily measure that. A point that was made in my original review was probably the need to expand time use surveys. And I suspect that will be even more needed going forward. Now, the question is, can we make them less onerous? Filling in a time diary is a bit tedious. There is potential scope using digitalization to make it less onerous. And I believe there are plans to develop an app that ESCoE and the ONS are working on, which will help that. But beyond that, I wonder whether there is scope for what you might call automatic harvesting of such information. I was always very impressed that Microsoft Teams at the OBR would tell me how much time I was spending in meetings, how much time I was spending networking with other people, how much time I was spending reading stuff, and so forth. And it does raise the question about whether there might be other ways of harvesting this information. The final leg of this is back to artificial intelligence, where there are a number of academics and commentators who are pointing to the threat from artificial intelligence to many professional roles which have hitherto been thought of as relatively safe, skilled jobs, so radiographers, pilots, accountants. And I think the important thing here is it's not just that artificial intelligence can provide a partial substitute for some of these jobs, but in many cases a superior substitute. So if you take radiographers looking at X-rays for tumors and things like that, first of all, it doesn't take that many X-rays to actually train an artificial intelligence machine to diagnose from an X-ray whether there is a tumor or not. I'm told something like 300 or something. And once you've done that, it's already in a position to outperform humans. So these are potentially something that will substitute for humans as doing things better. Now, that doesn't mean to say those jobs will necessarily completely disappear, but they will certainly change in form. What tasks people are doing will change in the same way as what secretaries used to do is very different from what secretaries today do. The other thing, of course, from this will be there will be interest in following the impact of AI on productivity and public finances. So I can see quite a significant agenda here going forward in the world of work. What about macro? My territory. Well, here we seem to be going back to the future. I started my career back in the mid-70s. Joe Grice and I used to share an office in the Treasury together way back then. And there are an awful lot of echoes of that time. So, you know, we've seen, first of all, the pandemic and now the war in Ukraine, which have been putting globalization into reverse with businesses sort of bringing back home supply chains. So long just-in-time supply chains being replaced by shorter and more diversified supply chains. That tends to mean that there'll be more focus inevitably on national value chains rather than global value chains. Now, the good thing here is it may make the geographical attribution of value added easier. It's going against some of the problems that were flagged in my review. On the sort of conventional macro front, we're seeing a resurgence in inflation and rebound in interest rates. And with that has come a return to the conventional monetary concerns of the 1970s. What's potentially happening to inflation expectations? Will we see real wage rigidity? We're back to a world of conventional monetary policy tools of using policy rates rather than asset purchases and so forth. And in principle, this is territory where we have the data and we understand it, at least if we're old enough to remember it. I think the key thing for the current generation of policymakers is they don't forget the lessons of history. However, on the fiscal side, I think it's worth noting that there are some interesting pressures on public spending that are potentially building up, which may have statistical consequences. If all you do is look at the overall share of government spending in GDP, that sort of bobbles around 40% of GDP. But beneath the surface, there is actually, has been quite a lot going on. So this shows you a breakdown of different types of public spending over it's 50 years or so. And the notable feature is the remorseless rise in the share of spending going on health and care and on welfare, particularly pensioner welfare as people age. It's worth saying the driver of the rise in healthcare spending, you might think that's associated with aging. Aging is not the primary driver of this. It's technological advance in medical care. But basically, what's happening as we get better at dealing with the remaining diseases and things like that, there are more and more expensive treatments that are involved. So this is an industry where technological advances don't tend to reduce costs, that they end up increasing costs because things become available that were previously not available. Education's been pretty constant. The way this increase in spending on health and welfare has been paid for has been by squeezing down on other components of spending, so particularly capital spending, which you go back to the 60s, 8.5% of GDP. We're now down to 3.5%. Council houses are part of that, but not all of it by any means. A bit from other current spending, but debt interest, which, because interest rates have been trending down in the last 30 or 40 years, debt interest has been falling. That potentially is now reversing somewhat, and layered on top of that has been an increase in debt stocks as a result of the financial crisis and the pandemic, but also defense. So the dividend from the ending of the Cold War, the purple bits, was useful in providing the room for the expansion in health. Now, with the Ukraine conflict, it's difficult to see defense, if anything. The pressure there must be to increase spending. So the debt interest and defense components are likely to, if anything, increase. The government said it wants to increase capital spending, which has been at unusually low levels. But going forward, given that it's likely the trends in health expenditure and possibly also welfare spending will continue, there is going to be upward pressure on the share of spending, of public spending in GDP. And a consequence of that, I think, will be that there will be more attention paid to measuring output and productivity in the public sector, and whether these increases in spending are appropriate. So the work the ONS does in measuring output and productivity in these sectors, I think, may get more attention in the future. The final thing on this slide is that the rise in interest rates is quite likely to generate a degree of financial instability somewhere. It's unlikely to be in the core of the banking sector because of the much higher levels of resilience that they have now post-financial crisis. It's more likely to be in the fringes of the regulated sector, so outfits that have borrowed to invest in crypto assets and things like that. That in turn, if it does eventuate, may well prompt calls for collection of more granular data of some of these entities. Finally, just on future issues in the environment, the Stern Review was obviously very important in catalyzing action to limit global warming. There is now a widespread agreement that we have to move towards net zero by 2050 or 2060 for Chinese. And monitoring progress against the associated targets is obviously going to need robust statistical benchmarks, but also as policies are introduced to facilitate that, there may be associated statistical demands connected, say, with running an effective carbon pricing regime, particularly if border adjustment taxes are introduced, which tax embodied emissions, which would be necessary if different countries pursue these objectives at different rates, or companies try to get round domestic emissions limitations by offshoring activities to countries that don't have the same restrictions. Again, there may be interest in statistics that may be coming out of the ONS that are related to that. Finally, the recent review by Partha Das Gupta on the importance of biodiversity, and including calculations of allowance for that in our policy making, raises the importance of the ONS's work programme on measuring natural capital, which potentially then allows for including depreciation of such capital. And here I'll just briefly flick up a slide taken from Parther's report, showing the evolution of various components of wealth per capital, so wealth per capita, so physical capital increasing substantially since 1992, modest increase in human capital, but the natural world being depleted. Now, the one thing I would flag up here is, of course, these are capitals which don't have markets associated with them. So you have to input assumptions in constructing those capital measures. One thing we learned from the debate around the Stern Review was the key role played by, for instance, discount factors. So I would anticipate both more prominence for the ONS's work on this agenda, but potentially also more debate around the assumptions that underlie the statistics that are generated. So my concluding slides, I think the ONS has made great progress since I published my review 6 years ago. Just to substantiate that, here's a pat on the back from a recent publication. The raw data here comes from the British Social Attitude Survey and Public Confidence in Official Statistics. So these are surveys. There were more questions than I'd be able to get on the slide, but I thought these are the interesting ones. Different years. So the blue 2014, just about the time my review was published. Yellow, where we are now. Official statistics are accurate. A pretty good trend upwards there. Also on free from political interference. So I think these look pretty good numbers that ONS can be proud of. These two, I think, are interesting for comparison. It's hardly surprising that the government is low. The thing that is surprising is it seems to have increased a bit in the last couple of years. It may be, of course, 2016 was time of the Brexit campaign, and that probably did make respondents pretty jaundiced about official statistics. But I think even more remarkable is how low the trust is in the fourth estate, which is actually pretty shocking when you think about it. So if there's any journalists listening, pull your socks up. Okay, so ONS has made a lot of progress, but there's still much to do, and there's going to be continuing challenges, I think, particularly with digitalization and artificial intelligence, the world of work changing. On the macro side, the resurgence of inflation is taking us back to old issues, but the environment is posing new ones. And the pandemic reminds us that almost certainly there'll be completely unexpected issues that will arise in the next 5 years. So ONS is going to need to remain agile and adaptable. And I will conclude there.
Thank you very much. We do have some time for questions. So if you want to raise a question in the room, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Who wants to kick off?
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. It was really a great pleasure to listen to this. And
you're not my LSE student, are you?
yeah, I'm King student. Yeah. So my question is that do you think that there is another very important shift that needs to be made by economists? So shift from backward-looking to forward-looking economics, and what do I mean? The shift from explaining and understanding the historical structural impacts towards more of the forecasting models, towards more of the simulation models that could really try to understand what would happen in the future and prevent some negative externalities. So this would govern implementation of really different sort of models that economists use to, models from data science, who don't necessarily understand what's happening inside of the model, but really using the model to predict something in the future. The use of the models from financial world, which are really, show it's a great use towards predictory power. So do you think there is a really a needed shift from backward-looking to forward-looking economies with a more predictive power than necessarily, explanatory power? Thank you.
I think one has to be very cautious with any black box approach. I started my life back in the Treasury in the mid-70s as an economic forecaster. The Treasury model was, estimated on past data and, worked well over the past. But inevitably we found it failing to predict accurately as we went through the 70s. And that's always the case with economic models. And I think probably a lot of the other models that people are developing now will end up displaying the same characteristic. I think the way one should think about all models is they're a crutch for thinking about possible scenarios. Well, first of all, in explaining the past, as you correctly flagged, so decomposing the impact of different shocks and so forth. But also to the extent that you're using them for the future, it's their use in helping you think about possible worlds, I think, is where they become most valuable. The biggest mistake is to think that you can use models to predict the future. Even if you have a nice, stable, stochastic environment, there's still the residual uncertainty. If I throw a pair of dice, I can tell you the probability of a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4. But the nature of the real world is that we don't have nice, stable, stochastic distributions. It's much more a world where there are events that are drawn from some ill-defined, well, not even an ill-defined statistical distribution. Things happen. Who would have said, what's the probability of a financial crisis in 2006 and what its impact would be? Similarly, a global pandemic. You can ask yourself the question, what might it look like if we have a pandemic? And those sorts of exercises are useful. So at the OBR, one of the things we did in our fiscal risk report is examining particular sort of tail events or large events that might disturb the public finances, how bad they could be, and so forth. And armed with that, that's something potentially helpful for the government and the Chancellor. But the notion that we can predict what's going to happen, I think, is a mistake. So a lot of the new technology that's coming along it's a useful addition to the toolbox. But I think it would be a mistake to think it's the silver bullet.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Oh, a question here.
Thanks very much. Very much enjoyed the talk. I wanted to ask a question, I guess, from a bird's eye view. If we have to boil things down for policymakers in the government sector, on the one hand, you've enumerated so many ways in which we've improved the reliability of economic statistics. And at the same time, you've outlined so many ways in which the ongoing evolution of the economy and external events are undermining the reliability of our frameworks. So what should our overall message to policymakers be as to whether or not, are we treading water? Should we be telling them that overall things are becoming more reliable, less reliable? Where are the areas where we should tell them that we think on balance they can have greater confidence, and where do we have to urge that they have greater caution?
Okay, first of all, I think that the treading water analogy is the wrong one, that it's much more you're running just to stand still. It's like being on an elevator that's going backwards and you're having to run just to stay still, because the economy is always evolving and changing. I think the answer is, it is important to be honest with policymakers where you think the statistics are providing a good signal about what's going on and where they might be missing important things. So that transparency and that honesty in the presentation of the statistics is important. Now, policymakers on the other side will, sometimes get frustrated at this when you say, well, we don't really know what's happening here and so forth. It's like, when they're asking you to predict the future and you say, I can't predict the future. Well, you're useless, aren't you? Is often the response of non-economists to economists who say, you can't predict the future. But I do think at the end of the day, the right way to proceed is to be clear about where you think the world has changed sufficiently rapidly that you might be missing important things going on.
I think we've got time for one more question.
There's one up.
Thank you. And like the others, thank you very much for an absolute tour de force of what's going on. You mentioned at the end, in the last part of your presentation, a number of the challenges that are coming up, the digitalization, changes in the world of work and so forth. But social changes also have an impact on the economy. So should we add that? I'm thinking of things like, for example, the rise in inequality that we've seen in the last decade or two, and possibly the decline in trust. A small point also, you mentioned the use of time use surveys for measuring the output of people who've retired using voluntary work and so forth. Well, that's a situation I'm in. I'd be horrified to think that anybody was measuring what I actually, the value of my work by my time use, knowing how I spend my time on that. That's a small point. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm sure people would want to know both how much time you're spending on it and what you're doing that's made me forget. Things like social capital and so forth. Yes, certainly in the sort of missing capitals agenda, things like social capital, trust, and so forth. I think you can start thinking about can we capture those as well, and that's something that some economists are trying to think about how to value those. What I was going to say now. I had something in mind else to say to that. I'll come back in a minute. Certainly it's something worth this is a senior moment. This happens when you get to my age. A thought comes in your head and then it slips out.
Thank you very much. And we'll now break for lunch before the afternoon sessions. Thank you, everyone.